So if you're not aware of the sport, kayak and canoe race, there are different ways, like there's single person to four people can compete at one time. With kayak and C1, so the distances normally popular are 200 meters, 500 meters, and 1,000 meters. Okay, and it can be the 200 meters is very explosive. It's a very very explosive event, and again it's with the very distances it make it very unique by itself from energy demands. And if you look at some of the performances, again, these are all published data in 2013, 2014 World Champions. Of course, the numbers have changed quite a bit since then. But if you look at some of the numbers, like, less than 34 seconds for a male performer and less than 39 seconds for a female performer, 200 meters. So it's quite explosive sport. It's not really a very slow and long kind of an endurance event. Of course, the 1,000 meters, of course, it's again, you're looking at less than five minutes. So it's still quite explosive. But the demands of the sport is quite unique because it's a interplay between different systems through aerobic and anaerobic pathways. The shorter it is, probably the anaerobic capacity plays a huge role. But nonetheless, the aerobic profile still plays a crucial role in the sport. So the difference between the genders has been documented about 11 to 15%. Now, this is again keeps changing year to year. We have had some really close counters in New Zealand when I was working with the New Zealand high performance teams. So yeah, it's a very interesting one how the numbers keep changing between the genders as well and different stages. If you look at the physiological profile, if we 200 meters is of course the anaerobic way is quite dominant, and the aerobic pathway is still very important because to be like 36 to 43% of aerobic, you need a strong aerobic foundation nonetheless. But the anaerobic demands, of course, is much more for 200 meters. But when we look at the 1,000 meters, more longer duration one, then we're talking more about the aerobic demands dominating the factor. So it's a very unique because looking at from a training perspective, you need a good balance in terms of training, and you have a very good understanding in terms of how you can train an athlete all the way through the process. If you look at the VO2 max range, it's just an average of 59 to 69. But again, there are some outliers. If you look at the Norwegian elite kayakers, they've been documented 73.7, which is quite a lot. Okay, it's quite high. Now, one very key thing that we need to understand as sports scientists here, that VO2 max, yes, could be a very important factor nonetheless, but we also have to look at the VO2 max is more from the central aspect, from central adaptation perspective, right? We also need to look at the peripheral side of things in terms of muscle oxygenation, because that's a very big factor. So what I'm trying to say is that the ability to repeat endurance from the working muscles, the oxygen supply to the working muscles, that's an important and key crucial element in the sport as well. So if you look at, again, key determinants, we talk about high maximal oxygen uptake, which is very, very important. Again, the anaerobic capacity, I cannot, it's again, plays a very, very crucial role. There's few studies we have documented muscle strength, particularly in the upper body. There's some really strong correlation with bench pull and one arm row. Now, I just want to make one thing very clear here. Just because there is a correlation doesn't mean it should not be equated as causation. Yes, it is. There's a strong correlation between bench pull and one arm row in terms of how the board is being moved. What we saw in these studies is that the athletes who were actually stronger in these movements, they actually could propel the boat faster. But this, again, needs to be studied a little bit further because this study has not been looking into across maturation and in terms of the development athletes as well. So we need to take it with a grain of salt. That's what I'm trying to say. But nonetheless, strength and power are key ingredients for the sport. Technical efficiency, of course, no doubt, because again, there's so much of drag that can happen. And if your technical competency is not there, then you end up spending a lot of your energy and not propelling the body the way you would, not propelling the boat as fast as you would like. Peak VO2 max and high fraction of VO2 max. Again, very important. The longer the event is, it's even more crucial. Okay, and your ability to, in fact, now if you look at the physiology, there's been a bit of an update as well in terms of the energy profiling. Before we thought that the longer the event, beyond 1 minute, that's where the aerobic kicks in. But even to you repeatedly propel the boat fast and then recover quickly between, that also requires a lot of aerobic demand as well. So even for the shorter 500 meters, one needs to have a good, strong aerobic foundation. Again, the Lecter threshold and critical power. Critical power is, again, power output by time to exhaustion. So how explosive an athlete can propel the boat without getting fatigued. So that's a key element here, especially with the shorter events. And again, as I said, peripheral adaptation, muscle oxidation, because it's sometimes we found few papers recently that had looked into that peripheral adaptation is more important than VO2 max by itself. So that's something that to be considering as well, because historically we have looked a lot into the VO2 max side of things. But now we're realizing that we need to look at the both ends of the spectrum in terms of developing the athlete overall. So if you look at the phases, we're just going to put them to just simplify things: recovery, catch and pull, and exit. We're going to be looking at mainly in the recovery, catch and pull. So if you can look at the photos on the right, it'll tell you each phase. So it's a catch and pull where a lot of forces are being produced. That's where you're propelling the boat as fast as you can. So in the recovery phase, the paddle, it's traveling through the air, horizontal to water. If you're looking at the right arm application, so if you look at the photo on the A, it's a left trunk rotation. So there's a lot of rotational forces, a torque that goes through the trunk. And it's very unique because with kayaking, unlike when you're rotating, standing through the kinetic chain using the hips, here you are limited. So the trunk is going through a lot of torque as we're rotating the body to propel. So, and that's why we see a lot of injuries, which I'm going to get to in the future slides. The trunk, because of this, especially the trunk, the lumbar vertebrae, they're not very resilient when it comes to torque, rotational forces. So that's something a very important consideration when we are actually looking up to training kayakers. So elbow extension and then shoulder moderately extended. We also see a lot of shoulder issues, especially in the catch and pull phase, because again, as I said, there are a lot of things happening here. It's the glenohumeral joint, which is a shoulder joint, predominantly acting on it, but at the same time, the scapulothoracic muscles are involved as well. And sometimes, because of the interplay between the two, we see a lot of muscular imbalances with kayakers, more often than not. So if you look at the catch and pull phase, if you can, the initiator of the sub phase, blade is positioned nearly perpendicular to the water surface. And it's the pull. This is where the maximum power is generated to accelerate the boat. Because we got to remember one thing. There is a lot of, the drag forces play a big role. That is through the boat from the water and also from the air and from the wind as well. So if the drag forces are greater and if you're not able to propel, your boat is not going to get faster. So the goal is here to propel the boat as fast as you can. So all the forces, the resultant force we are talking about, is put onto the paddle as quickly as possible. So it's not just the force, but how quickly the force is being produced. That's very important as well. And then we're looking at some of the kinematic factors like the scapula is adducted, retracted, and the glenohumeral. So it's an interplay between the glenohumeral joint along with the scapulothoracic joint as well. And we also need to not forget that within that stroke of propelling, there is a bit of hip and knee extension. That is because of the foot force being produced as well. And that's an important aspect. It often gets underplayed because we don't realize, we always think that, the sport is more about the upper body, but there is a bit of contribution from the lower body as well. From a research point of view, we're still trying to figure out how much would that be. It's again, case by case, and it's about how much that propulsion actually helps in terms of the paddle. So with the pull phase, there has been some studies that has looked into the EMG. EMG is the electromyography in terms of the muscle activation. And it's very clear that the latissimus dorsi being a very dominant player, and that's again kind of makes sense because the latissimus dorsi, if you look at the origin and insertion, it goes all the way from the shoulder, glenohumeral joint, going all the way to the thoracolumbar fascia, which is in the junction. So it's one of the powerhouse of propelling the body boat, because when you're extending the shoulder, you're adducting the shoulder. There's a lot of forces that you can generate from the latissimus dorsi, along with the rhomboids, I would say as well. But even like the supraspinatus muscles, which is more of a shoulder stabilizers. We're looking at supraspinatus is one of the key stabilizers across the 4 rotator cuff group. So that and the upper trapezius also play a role, and a significant role, I would say, from injury prevention point of view, that stabilizes the whole shoulder. Because imagine if the latissimus dorsi was all the way active and dominant, then it's also going to create a lot of extension on the spine, because it's a big sheet of muscles connected right from the shoulder joint all the way to your thoracolumbar fascia. So that's why it is a good interplay between the shoulders and the the thoracoscapular muscles as well. So as you can see, the stroke rate range from 90 to 120 strokes per minute. So it is a primary determinant factor. Again, the muscle forces definitely play a huge role in able to propel the boat as fast as possible. If you look at the kinetics, the diagram on the right side will give you a good idea in terms of how the resultant force is being created through the exit to catch. Now, again, the goal is to maintain force production per stroke during the propulsive phase and increase the stroke rate as fast. So again, we're not looking at just the force by itself. We're looking at impulse, the force by time, how quickly the force is being produced during a period of time. And as you can see, drag forces can increase 14% in kayaks with unwanted boat movement. So any of the drag movement will probably slow you down. So it is very important that these to be considered. And now when we look at forces and how much when the question is often people ask me, okay, how strong a kayaker should be. Now that depends a lot in terms of the anthropometry, which we are going to get at, and also how much of the rate of force development, okay, they can produce. Because sometimes we have to equate the drag forces, and it's not easy, because some of the drag forces through friction in the water, yes, we can take account for. And we can also create some regression modeling. And you must have already, as a scientist, you must be doing a lot of regression modeling that actually helps you in terms of predicting how much of force that can be generated through a particular paddle that can actually propel the boat faster, okay, considering all the drag forces. So there are a lot of methods, algorithms that have been created that helps us as a practitioner as well to make sure that we understand how strong or powerful we need to help the kayaker be. Now, if you look at some of the numbers, like total drag force, again, this is just an equation. But if you look at, again, looking at the hydronic, we're looking at both aerodynamic and hydrodynamic drag forces. Now, if you look at the peak force in men, it's about 375 newtons and women 290 newtons. This is, again, a study done in Australian elite kayakers. This was about 4 or 5 years back. This, again, changes with time. Remember, we're also talking about, when we're talking about forces, we're also talking about the body mass of the person propelling. So, yeah, and it's from the impulse. If you look at the impulse, we're looking at about 109, and for women, it's about 80 newtons per second. So impulse is really key, because it's not just about the forces. And another factor that we need to understand here when we talk about forces is that being seated and being able to propel is a very different kind of a force the transmission compared to when you're standing. Okay, so when we talk about 375 newtons, it may not look a big number, but because the person is seated and because the upper body is the dominant factor to be doing that, it is actually quite a lot. It comes out to, okay, when we actually look into compare it with some of the forces that have been created by other athletes. So it's a quite an interesting force, because the numbers can be sometimes deceiving. It's much more than what it actually looks here. So if a bit of a differentiation between canoe and, you might be already knowing this, the position is the kneeling position, and they have like one blade, so they propel through one blade rather than in kayak, there are kind of 2 blades on both sides, And so the manipulation of paddling is slightly different, and it's a more asymmetrical rhythmic activity compared to kayak. Kayak is a more symmetrical, and canoe is more asymmetrical, and that's probably the biggest difference. Canoe is considered to be more stable as a boat, but if you look at the event, kayak is much more faster in terms of propelling. So from a training considerations, physiological and biomechanical. Now we've got to look at both sides, right? If we're looking at from a training perspective, and this is where we talk about bridging the gap between the science and practice, and this is one of my biggest, this is what we've been doing all across now. We're trying to bridge that gap because sometimes we do the research, right? And if the research is not context driven and not applied for the practitioners and scientists, it's going to be very, very hard for us to use it, right? So that's why sometimes we need to look at factors that actually we can consider in terms of training. So, and that's what been a big thing that we've been trying to do all over right now in New Zealand. We are doing some work in India as well. I'm talking about my company, Athlete Institute. So that's what we're trying to do. And also in Europe as well. So when we talk about training considerations, all the research that's around done in terms of understanding the three systems and how they interplay, that's going to be an important factor because it's so easy, to get caught up when we look at some of the numbers. Because again, if we don't provide context to the information, it becomes noise. Okay. Now we know that all the three systems like oxidative, glycolytic, and phosphogen, all the three system, energy pathways are important in this sport. But there is a dominance every now and then. And how do we look at and how do we go about training people? Okay. And profiling can be done now through technology, through great algorithms, through some really good statistical tools that we have. You can actually make it very specific and make it more person specific and individualized in terms of training. But we're looking at the bioenergetics of the sport itself, which is not very hard in terms of the duration, intensity, So factoring all of these things, then we put things into context, and then, we try and find out in terms of what are the training considerations. Duration of events, very, very important. Again, long and short, the training will be definitely different nonetheless, because a 200 meter compared to 1,000 meter, from an energy point of view, it makes a huge difference as well, right? So that's why we got to be very careful in terms of how we plan our training year round, because some of the explosive, we talk about the fast twitch, people who are very more fast twitch dominant, we need to be carefully tapering their program so that we don't really make them slower as they become closer to competitions. Okay, so it is a very important factors to consider, both on water and even dry land. So we look at both sides in making it as individually as possible and as specific to the person, rather than just trying to be a kind of a cookie cutter program that we call it. We also need to look at the kinetic and kinematics, like the forces involved, the kinetics, and also the movement patterns, because now I don't know if you're aware, but recently there's been a lot of injuries that's been documented, not only just kayakers, but through a lot of in paddle sport. And so this has to be looked into from all aspects. I'm going to get to the injury part anyways very soon, but we need to consider when it comes to program design, when it comes to on-water training, when it comes to even dry land training, we need to look at the person individually as opposed to just generalizing the sport itself. So let's look at some of the literature, what the literature says in terms of injuries. It's very interesting. I mean, because it's an upper body dominant sport, it's a no-brainer that the shoulder is one that gets hits probably the most, and some of the findings are quite straightforward. They look at a reduced internal rotation. That's 54.8%. That's quite a huge number in terms of more than half. Then we look at some of the injuries like thoracolumbar region, I mentioned earlier, the lumbar region, the shoulder region, the forearm, wrist. So there's quite a lot of injuries on the upper extremity because, again, the sport is quite dominant in the upper extremity. Now, I want to tell you one thing. With injuries, the research, when it comes to injuries, is a tricky one because there are a lot of factors that play a role. Okay, it's not so straightforward that, say, for example, if you look at the first one, reduce internal rotation of the glenohumeral and someone is injured. It's not so straightforward because there are other factors like the volume. Like, for example, if few of the kayakers have been in a program which is very high volume and they have not previously been into, or the intensity has been increased very rapidly in short time, then the chances, of course, they will go through an injury. So we've got to look at both macro in terms of volume, in terms of intensity, in terms of recovery, and then also micro in terms of if they have any limitations from as the study says, internal rotation of the shoulders. So we've got to look at both pictures and not just one. So these are quite a common injuries that have been documented across different literature. With canoe sprinters, though, it's been a tricky one because there's not very clear understanding of the injuries. Even though some of the papers they've seen the shoulder pathology is quite common in there as well. If you look at some of the factors, again, mechanism, one of the common factors, most kayakers get injured in the propulsive phase. Again, it's probably makes sense because it's that phase where you're propelling the boat as quickly as possible. A lot of forces are going through. A lot of forces are going through the shoulder joint in terms of internal rotation, adduction, and also if you're familiar with the word, I'm not sure, but subacromial space, which is the space between the acromial and the glenohumeral joint. So for certain people, it's the shoulder joint is designed very differently. The space is quite limited, and the bone almost grind one on each other. Now, this is quite a common issue with a lot of kayakers, especially in New Zealand that I have worked with. And there's two things here. One is the joint structure, which you can't do much. You can only manage around it. And the other one is actually, it's how some of the muscles are timing in terms of, it could be both in on-water technique and also in terms of what they do in terms of the training. One common example is the lack of scapular upward rotation and posterior tilt. So when you're talking about the glenohumeral joint, the internal rotation is going through. If the scapula the scapula is not supporting enough, then there is kind of an overplay of the glenohumeral joint muscles, right? So, and that's where you see a lot of issues in terms of the subacromial spacing, which often results in impingement with many kayakers. So very common. One common example, if you can see on the right-hand side, muscular imbalances, which is a very, very common. We've also done this in New Zealand here. There's a lot of over-dependent on the downward rotation. Now, if I go back to anatomy, latissimus dorsi, rhomboids, what are the two common factors? They not only retract or latissimus dorsi also extends the shoulders, but they kind of depresses the shoulder scapula and downwardly rotates the scapula. So both of them, they pull downwardly. So if you don't have some of the other muscles, like say, for example, your trapezius, your serratus, holding it and supporting it, then you'll always have the dominance of overplay of these bigger muscles, latissimus dorsi more so, and also with the rhomboids. So the two aspects to it, one is more from a joint perspective, from a structure itself, and then the other one is more from the muscular perspective. And it's nowadays, it's much more easier to look at things because we have different tools that can actually assess range of motion. We can also not only just assess range of motion, we can also study the technique on the water in terms of what is happening, especially when they fatigue. Because remember, sometimes when we do an assessment and screening, a person might look great when they're not fatigued, when they're fresh. But how they move when they're fatigued, that is what is of interest. And now we're trying to understand that more and more so from all different aspects. Again, the other thing is also in the exit phase. There's another study, two studies have looked into the horizontal abduction and then external rotation. There's a lot of capsular tightness that happens quite a bit, and it happens again, repeatedly. So it's a volume thing. It's a demanding sport, right, for the upper body, and it's almost because it's unique in the way that's propelled and shoulders moving in the sport. If the training beyond your water is not taken care of, then yes, of course, it's very easy to get a rotator cuff tear or deltoids being over dominant quite a bit, because these are big muscles, they're propulsive, so they actually help you to actually move faster on the boat. So if you look at a bit of the anthropometrical profile, again, this is based on one of the European Olympic team in 2014. This is a published review, that's why I'm sharing here. Again, not much of, probably now I would say the kayakers are a lot leaner, especially in New Zealand. If I compare right now, especially with the fat mass, I would say quite some of the kayakers are quite leaner than this. Again, that also helps because if you're looking at from the force being produced, right, you also considering the force, the body mass of your own as a kayaker. So that's why if you are able to produce force quickly, greater, with lower body fat or body mass, you will be propelling the boat faster. Okay, so from that perspective, now again, there's a thin line between that, because sometimes there could be a compromise between the body mass and the force being produced. But when you talk about force, we're talking about, again, more about impulse force, how much force is being produced over time. So from that perspective, it is very important that the anthropometrical side of things is taken care of, and that follows up with the nutritional side of things. So if you look at the energy intake, this is very interesting. Actually, this is the same study, same people who I just shared the anthropometrical profile. Now, if you look at the energy requirements for the male and female, it's quite a lot as in terms of recommended. And this is again the competitive phase when they're actually competing quite a lot. This is actually quite a big number, to be honest, overall. But and where they were actually taking was quite different. So they were actually kind of a little bit lower on the lower side, all of them. So there will always be this shift, and it'll all depend on what phase of the competition they are in. We are well aware of the different supplementation that is taken as well in terms of the competition phase. So all of these things has to be considered in terms of who's getting what in terms of nutrition, because that's going to play a big role in terms of the recovery, right? As you can see, the energy intake itself may be a little short, but again, there were different phases when they actually had a different requirement overall over the phase. But what is interesting is the next slide. The next slide, if you look at some of the nutrients, okay, and that's clearly showing as well in terms of like the recommended, say from a carbohydrates point of view, looking at about 7 to 10 grams per kg body weight, right? And they were quite short from that perspective. If you look at protein, they were almost there around it. Fat, they were much more than what was recommended, right? Dietary fiber, again, if you look at dietary fiber, they were nowhere close to what is recommended. And the saturated fat was a bit higher than what was recommended. Now, when I say recommendation, sometimes, again, we need to understand this very importantly, that sometimes recommendation is great on the paper, but it may not look into the holistic model of the person itself. Okay, we got to look at the entire thing as well. And sometimes it's very, very difficult to, especially younger athletes who have just becoming, elite, to convince them to eat in a specific manner throughout. Okay, and this is where the psychosocial side of things comes in really, really handy. They all go hand in hand, according to me, because nutrition, after some time, it's because it's not that the athletes don't know what to eat. It's just that whether they commit to what they should be eating throughout, and that is where the biggest change you can bring in. Okay, so it's quite interesting. The same people, and yeah, even though the energy is kind of on the shorter side, but the nutrients, you can probably see how different they are based on what was recommended. Now, we're looking at the psychosocial factors. I'm going to share a few things here because this is an important aspect for a sports science. As I said, all of these topics are probably. I cannot do it justice in an hour. This is just an overview because they're all so in depth and they all play such an important role in overall development of any athlete, and not just kayaker, but any athlete. But some of the psychosocial factors should be in depth, and what we should be looking at when we're helping athletes as sports scientists is to be being more open and being more collaborative with all across, so that we are collaborating with across, whether it's a sports psychology person, whether it's a sports medicine person, all coming together. And I think it's a big team play, that I would call it. Like resilience, ability to adapt and positively under stress is an important factor. Okay, we want kayakers to be as resilient as possible. And there's an example here I would like to share. When I was working with two young kayakers who are almost about to make it to the elite cadet. We call it cadet program in New Zealand when they become an elite, get the elite status. And it was very surprising because both of them I was looking after, and one of them actually been actually thought of that he would be the next big thing. Okay, and from And the other one, who he was more about getting the job done, and not beyond that. And there was a big turnaround between the two, because what happened in the end as well, things like developing that self-awareness is such an integral factor, especially for a young athlete who is moving towards cadre. And the guy who was thought to be the next big thing actually did not value these small things. It might be looking very small, but it's a so integral factor. And developing the ability to focus and concentrate effectively. And these first 2 points have actually set the person. I'm the second person who was probably who probably no one thought that he would probably make it to the cadre. He became cadre before the first one. Okay, and it just these psychosocial factors are so important, and it should be, I think, from educational perspective, for young athletes, for young kayakers moving to the cadre, is an important prospect as well. I'd like to share another story of my. If you must have seen the photo on the front page as well, it's the most probably my favorite athlete I've ever worked with. I've been very privileged to work with. Her name is Brian McCleley. She's a cadre athlete from New Zealand. He has competed at world champions as well, and she's one of the person I cannot say anyone more so, who is a great effective management of her arousal level. So when her excitement, her emotions, how she controls before the event, after the event, I've never seen anyone better than that. And this is mainly because, again, self-awareness, reflecting, going, understanding herself, trying to understand more, a little bit more, and most importantly, the debriefing that we do in terms of feedback. She's the one who's always been proactive in terms of asking, in terms of what she could do differently with everything. And this was something very, very special, because to be associated with, especially with Brian McCleley, because she has done really, really great in terms of how she became cadre from a junior athlete. Again, effective management of negative distractions. This is a big one, especially for younger ones. It's not easy. It's not easy when you're competing. It's not easy when you're also going to university to study. At the same time, your social life, they all play a big role. And that's why I think this is how your distractions and how this could be educated is an important factor. And sometimes, and why I always say they're so interlinked, if the psychosocial factors are not there, it will affect the nutrition side of things. It will affect the training side of things, and overall. And we have seen this. We've seen this over the last 6-7 years. We've seen how these things, when a young athlete, young kayaker comes in, moves to another city just to do kayaking, and lives in a hostel, and how they prepare themselves in terms of moving to the cadre, it's a big deal breaker overall. There are a few people who actually makes it, and then because of the whole attitude and how they manage themselves, some people actually never end up making it cadre. Again, setting effective long and short-term goals, again, very, very important as well, because sometimes, yes, it is about the big picture, what they want to be in a few years' time, and where they want to go, whether they want to be part of Olympics or something like that. But the short-term goals are so important, and that's we make them more and more aware of. We make them write them down. What do you want to do in the next few weeks? What do you want to do in the next training, and how you want to go about organizing your training? How are you going to manage your studies? Okay, I'm talking about studies because again, we're talking about those younger athletes who are making up all the way to elite. How will you manage that academic life? How will you manage your social life? What are the 3 or 4 main key goals that will help you organize yourself? What are the tools that you need to organize yourself? So we make them write these things so that they are looking through it. They're looking at more through internally, and then they can tap into some of the resources. Not always does it work, but in most of the time, yes, this has worked to be quite useful for most of our athletes here. Visualization, another very important factor. This is I guess it's common for any sport. We visualize how we're going to go for that special occasion. I remember, again, coming back to Briar, she narrated how she visualized when she won the 200 meters women's here. And it was amazing because it's so powerful, because that whole, that the visualization, and how you're going to be doing it, and how well you'll be doing it, or where you'll struggle, or how you're going to be holding those nerves that time is probably an important factor. Okay, for any athlete, I would say that. And team culture. Team culture is very, very key, because if our athletes who are there, kayakers who are going to be working, if they do not feel part of a team, if the culture is missing, if they are going through anxiety, they're worried that they won't be make it in the team, then it's going to be very hard to get a team. Okay, and that's something we have seen, because we have to nurture them in terms of when they're coming in. We have to make them when I say comfortable, and not in a wrong way, comfortable enough to be confident. Okay, we don't want them to be second guessing every time, because and that can go dramatically wrong, especially with younger people, because it just puts them off, and they started looking at. We have seen few people who have gone downhill completely because of this entire thing of the team culture. And team culture is the part where we are talking about all of us are involved as sports scientists, sports medicine team. We're talking about everyone who's involved with that kayaker some way or the other. And communication is the key, because this is where we can build that team, which will probably last us forever. Okay. And that is the most powerful thing, I would say, because that can really, really create some really, really beautiful things. That's what I had to present. I know I have only 45 minutes, and then I thought we'll do a discussion and question and answer. Again, I said I try to keep it as simple and an overview. And all of these topics can probably go in a lot of depth. Okay. If you want me to repeat anything, please feel free to ask me. Any questions? Welcome. So
we have opened the session for question and answers.
Okay.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
It was a very nice presentation.
Thank you.
Sir, I want to ask that the canoers, because of their half kneeling position, they are very prone to getting pain in the knee. So I have seen a few canoers getting this bursitis. So is there any protective equipment that can help them in this? I mean, they use a thermocol kind of structure, but I don't think so it is helping them so much. Still, they are very prone to getting this intrapatellar bursitis.
Definitely, there are compression guards nowadays available. I would say that canoe even more so. Like it's again, with knee issues that happen again. It happens because of some of the timing of some of the muscle groups are not being at play. And from a long-term perspective, I would say yes, the protective tool can definitely help with some compression and with some guarding. But for long-term, I would say to be actually training the hip and the lower extremity as well for the canoe. We do a lot of training for that, because to be able to stabilize on that kneeling position, you need the hip to be not only stable and mobile, but to be able to controlling those forces across. So I would say from a long-term perspective, a good training, looking at the person, looking at the hip complex, and also, yes, there are some protective guards that can be used as well if someone is more prone.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hi, Kaushik. This is Naina here from Imphal NCOE. I'm a nutritionist out here. Just to connect a bit of your background, I have been in New Zealand too, in Auckland, and I did my level 6 in advanced exercise prescription from NZIS, New Zealand Institute of Sports.
Okay.
And I've also had a privilege of visiting AUT and all those places. And we were also involved with the Sevens team for some time. because they wanted us to come up with some supplements if we really recommended any at all during our study, during our course. So I just would like to understand that those days when we actually, the whole team, when we came up with this thing called should we really recommend some sort of a supplement or not, ultimately we came up with saying that no, they start with natural stuff as opposed to going in for supplements, and only if it is actually required. This was back in 2014. I do not know how the scene is right now, so just a little curious to understand what is the scene of supplements in New Zealand at the moment.
Yeah, it's it's, to be honest, again, we're looking at, it's not much has changed, to be honest, because the rules and regulations, especially around supplementation in New Zealand and also Australia, is quite strict, which is good in a way, because we're looking at, when we look at supplementation, we need to ask this question: why do we need it? Are we getting enough from the consumption that they're having? And
right.
What are the supplements from an evidence perspective that actually makes the difference, which is not negatively or it's harmful? So this is an important question to ask always. Well, to be honest, really honest with you, apart from the creatine supplementation or the protein supplementation, in certain cases, nothing much has changed in terms of the supplementation. That's what I'm aware of.
So the market hasn't grown, or there's no demand for supplements as such, or it's.
There is demand. It's just, again, it's so person specific. Say, for example, if someone is not getting enough omega-3, omega-6, and they might be getting that supplement through supplementation, but it's very difficult to say that there is a market specifically through for the athletes only. It's very difficult to say. Again, there's certain sport, they're all about supplementation, like say bodybuilding or something else. But I'm talking about if you're looking at kayak or even some of the team sport, I wouldn't say that it has changed quite drastically since 2014.
Right. Yeah. Thank